Hello, and welcome to the third ever episode of the Comic Book Club.
What did you want me to say there?
I'm your host, Kendra Forte, maybe?
Oh, well, you're the host. I'm the co-host.
Well, I thought maybe I'd let you say it first for once.
Oh, I was caught totally off guard.
I'm your host, Matt Lasik.
I'm your co-host, Kendra Forte.
Yes. This is the fourth time we're saying this, so pardon us if we sound a little defeated. This week, we're going to be talking about an actual comic book for the first time, instead of just abstract concepts. We'll probably still talk about abstract concepts, but it's going to be in relation to a specific comic book. This week, we're covering Marvel Masterworks' The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, which collects Amazing Fantasy issue 15 and The Amazing Spider-Man issues 1 through 10. Very just standard origin stuff, very early Spider-Man. So before we jump into covering the actual contents of the comic, I want to share the history behind the creation of Spider-Man, because it's not exactly clear what actually happened. There's two stories, and to tell those stories, I first have to tell you about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. So pretty much anyone who's seen any Marvel movie knows who Stan Lee is. He has worked for Marvel since, I don't even know how, since the 40s, I think. He's worked as a writer, an editor, publisher, etc., etc. He's basically done everything there is to do in the realm of comic books, save actually drawing. And Jack Kirby is his creative equivalent, but for art. So Kirby has worked for both Marvel and DC and a number of other publishers over the years. They have both passed, but Stan Lee and Jack Kirby worked as a duo for Marvel in the 60s, when the was referred to as the Silver Age of comics, of superhero comics, which is sort of the second wave after the initial wave in the 30s and 40s. So in the 60s, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby both worked for Marvel, and they co-created basically every important Marvel character, including Captain America. Well, okay, never mind, I was wrong. Captain America is a different story, but we'll get to that. So they co-created the Fantastic Four. They co-created Marvel's iteration of Thor, the Avengers, Iron Man, Hulk, Black Panther, the X-Men, Ant-Man, etc., etc. When it came to Spider-Man, however, there was a creative split, and this is where we'll start getting into it. So during the golden age of comics, which was pre-World War II, Jack Kirby worked with a writer by the name of Joe Simon, and the two of them are the ones that created Captain America initially. So according to Jack Kirby, during that time, Kirby and Simon had also developed a character named the Silver Spider, who was more of like a secret spy type character, but he went unused. And then in the 60s, when Marvel's publisher was looking for a new character, Kirby said, hey, why don't we try and use this old character that I have lying around named the Silver Spider? And he and Lee eventually developed that into Spider-Man. But when the time came for Kirby to do the artwork, when he did the rough pencils, Lee hated it. So he replaced him as artist with an artist by the name of Steve Ditko. So that's Kirby's story. Stan Lee's story is that he had wanted to do a bug-themed hero for a while, and he just kind of was sitting around, just going through a list of insects, and then he said Spider-Man and said, that sounds good, and then created Spider-Man. And then, et cetera, Kirby does the art, Lee hates it, replaces him with Ditko. So that's just a brief glimpse into the politics that was going on between Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, because even though they did incredibly influential work in the realm of early Marvel comics, they did not really get along well. According to Kirby, he would try and put in more serious underlying stories, like themes and more like adult topics into his work. And then Stan Lee would come along and replace it all with like jokes and quips and like like whatever. And in Kirby's eye, devalue the story. But regardless of how they felt for one another, they still did incredibly influential work. So the Spider-Man came about during the time that Marvel was transitioning from doing like horror and mystery and sci-fi stuff into superhero stuff. So a lot of the series that came to be known as places as where Iron Man and Ant-Man and Doctor Strange stories were published were initially more of the earlier stuff. So like Tales of Suspense, Amazing Fantasy, which was formerly called Adult Fantasy.
Ooh, that sounds risque.
Tales to Astonish. All of these series that eventually became superheroes books were initially other types of fantasy books. And in this time period, comic book publishers were limited to a certain number of series that they could release per month. So Amazing Fantasy was canceled to be replaced with Spider-Man. And this was a common thing that Marvel did. As we talked last week, Marvel, before they fully dedicated to superheroes, Marvel had a tendency to just kind of jump around to whatever was the big seller of the time, whether that be like comedy, romance, westerns, etc. So Amazing Fantasy only ran for 15 issues, and the final issue was the origin of Spider-Man, and that was so successful that they canceled it and replaced it with his own solo series.
What was in the rest of Amazing Fantasy?
It doesn't even matter. Like, it literally doesn't matter. I do not know. I've never looked into it because it does not matter. They are not. They are inconsequential. They are not. They're probably just like average fantasy stories. I could not tell you what the first 14 issues of. I know issue 15 of Amazing Fantasy like the back of my hand, but I could not tell you what was in those first 14 issues. I do not know. Speaking of issue 15 of Amazing Fantasy, let's talk about it.
I was wondering why it felt so
fast.
So fast.
Yeah. So this is indicative of the comic industry at the time. Nowadays, each single issue of a comic book is part of like a multi-issue arc. And those arcs might be part of an even larger story arc that spans like multiple years. But back here in the 60s, issues weren't like that. Every issue was its own self-contained story. In fact, one of the groundbreaking things that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby did was introducing the concept of the multi-issue story arc with the Galactus trilogy in the pages of Fantastic Four. So yes, whereas nowadays, like for example, the series Ultimate Spider-Man, which takes place in an alternate universe and came out in the year 2000, and kind of put Peter Parker back in high school. He did not appear in his Spider-Man costume until issue 3.
Yeah, but in here, he appeared like page 3.
Page 3, he gets bitten by the spider. Same page, he's already crawling walls, and then like page 4 or 5, page 6, he's in his outfit. It's just just going right along at a breakneck pace. Here's Peter Parker. He's a loser. He lives with his aunt and uncle. They love him. He's bitten by a spider. Bam, now he's a wrestler. Bam, now he's a superhero.
The end.
Just keep it going. Keep it going. But yes, this was also in the age where each individual panel did not show much action. The panels were more about like single actions or just dialogue, and then the actions would be told via captions, which nowadays is kind of weird because nowadays comic books are like, ooh, action, and watch that guy punch the other guy. But in this, it's just like instead of showing Spider-Man performing on television sets and talk shows.
They just say,
in the days that follow, the Spider-Man becomes a sensation of the nation. So then, as everyone who knows Spider-Man knows, Uncle Ben is shot and killed by a home invader. Peter puts on his outfit, his Spider-Man costume out of rage, and tracks down the killer, only to realize that the killer is a petty thief that he had the opportunity to stop earlier that day. And the issue ends with him delivering the criminal to the police, realizing that it's technically his fault that Uncle Ben is dead, which is debatable. Butterfly effect and all that.
Definitely his fault.
Okay. Interesting. And then in a large block of caption text is the first appearance of the famous catchphrase, "With great power, there must also come great responsibility," which was very nearly my high school yearbook quote.
I'm not surprised.
My actual senior yearbook quote was a Captain America quote.
Also not surprised.
But yes, so nowadays that phrase is very closely tied with the character of Uncle Ben. But initially, it was just thrown in the caption at the end of the story. It was not until years later that it was retconned that Uncle Ben said that. So this is a very interesting story in that Peter Parker's kind of an everyman, and that was the point of his character when Stan Lee and Steve Ditko were creating him, or whoever it was created him. That anyone could have been bitten by the spider, anyone could have become Spider-Man, anyone could have learned the same lessons.
I don't think so, because wasn't it a thing that he was a genius and that he created his own super web fluid?
He did create the web shooters and the web fluid, which is another thing that was kind of explained away in 2 panels, and that's it.
But other than creating,
other than having the chemical acumen to create web shooters, everything else is you could replace.
This could be anyone.
Yeah. In fact, Marvel has a series that every so often appears and throws out a couple one-shots called What If, that explores short alternate timelines. That's usually just starts with what if and then blank. The title of the story is in the form of a question. So there are a multitude of stories that follow the format of what if blank had been bitten by the spider? What if Aunt May had been bitten by the spider? What if Flash Thompson had been bitten by the spider? Et cetera, et cetera. And pretty much in every one, it does include the caveat that Peter Parker somehow discovers it and gets involved and creates the web shooters. So there is that yes, Peter Parker is the one that created web shooters and probably is the only one that could have created web shooters. But there's still the thing that he's still, other than that, he's an everyman. And there's nothing particularly special about him that makes him a hero except for his code, "With great power must also come great responsibility." So after that, as mentioned, Amazing Fantasy is canceled and replaced with Amazing Spider-Man's own ongoing. And issue 1 is a crossover. And this is fairly common for this era of comics, cross-promotion. So say you're a child and you walk to your local newsstand and you go, "What's this weird spider dude?" They probably didn't say dude in the 60s. "What's this weird Spider-Man on the cover of this thing? I don't know him." "Oh, but I know the Fantastic Four," because everyone knows the Fantastic Four.
Were the Fantastic Four the big superheroes of the time?
Yes. They were the first, they were the beginning of the Silver Age of comics, and they were an incredible runaway hit. They put Marvel on the map.
Good for Marvel.
Yeah. So yes, this was fairly common of either the first issue of a new ongoing would feature crossover, or in some other big ongoing, i.e. Avengers or X-Men or Fantastic Four, they would show up for a cameo, and then they'd have a little box at the bottom that says, "For more of this character, check out The Amazing Spider-Man, now on sale." Basically the equivalent of commercials. So issue 1 establishes the basic tenets of an early Spider-Man story, in that Aunt May has money troubles, Peter Parker is hated by his
classmates.
by his classmates. J. Jonah Jameson hates Spider-Man, etc., etc.
Any basic Spider-Man fact is in this first episode. This first issue.
Right. Except for the fact where he assaults a military base and steals a plane.
And boy, does
he do that. So the main story that doesn't concern the Fantastic Four is that J. Jonah Jameson's son, who is an astronaut,
doesn't even make it to space. Makes it to
in atmosphere orbit, and then has some issues. And like Spider-Man's like, I'm the only one that can do it, even though like Spider-Man can't fly. So he instead breaks into a military base and forces a pilot to fly him up to the shuttle. And then J. Jonah Jameson says, it was all a hoax. Spider-Man purposefully broke the thing. It's his fault.
And honestly, he should have seen this coming.
Therefore, a threat or menace, yada, yada, yada. And then the backup story, so not only was every issue a self-contained story, it was also occasionally broken into 2 or even 3 stories. So they're just really compressing all these arcs. So the backup story for issue 1 has Spider-Man breaking into the Baxter Building, the home base of the Fantastic Four, and basically saying like, hey, I'm poor, but I have superpowers. Can you hire me? And then the Fantastic Four says, man, we're poor too. What do you think you're doing, man?
At some point, he fought the Fantastic Four.
He did fight the Fantastic Four because
he broke into the building, and they were like, that's not cool, dude.
Yeah. It has the concept of superheroes meeting for the first time and fighting before teaming up is so engraved into superhero culture that it is now like a meme that is referenced in universe that like, I guess we gotta fight now. And Spider-Man particularly is all like, he does not stop to ask any questions. If you put anyone in front of him that is not in just like street clothes, he will throw down. He literally any sort of costume that you put in front of him, his first instinct is just to beat the crap out of him. So, and then they introduced the Chameleon. Nowadays, iterations of the Chameleons have him that like his superpower is to change his features, but in this he's just
got masks.
He just has prosthetics to disguise his identity. And then the Chameleon does this thing that confuses me ever since I was a child reading these stories that they do a lot in early Spider-Man stories, in that the villain builds some sort of transmitter that sends a message that Peter somehow understands vis-a-vis his spider sense.
I don't think that's how spider sense works.
It is not. But this happens in these first 10 issues alone. This happens twice, that a villain builds a transmitter that talks to spiders, I guess. And then Peter understands it.
Every spider in a 10-mile radius is like, man, this message is not for me.
Right. So then Chameleon does a setup where he frames Spider-Man for a crime. They fight. Spider-Man reveals the Chameleon. The Fantastic Four read about it in the newspaper and say, maybe we shouldn't have beaten up that teenager that broke into our home. And then Spider-Man runs away crying into the night. He literally, the third to last panel reads, a lone figure loses himself in the shadows of the silent night, and then in a thought bubble, Spider-Man says, nothing turns out right, sob. I wish I had never gotten my superpowers. He doesn't even swing into the night, he just runs down an alleyway. So the next couple issues are, issue 2 introduces the concept of Spider-Man taking pictures for the Daily Bugle as he fights the Vulture, who is an older man.
He gets paid quite a lot for this, because at the end of this issue, it's like, Aunt May, you'll never have to worry about money ever again. We're gonna refurnish. I'm a
freelance photographer.
Yeah, I took 2 pictures for a local newspaper or a magazine, and now we're gonna refurnish your entire kitchen.
Yeah, it's the 60s, man. I don't know, but this is another issue that has a double billing. The first story is him fighting the Vulture. The second story is him fighting a character called the Tinkerer. And they're both very old men.
Yeah. This issue is just Spider-Man fights old guys.
Yeah. It is insinuated that Tinkerer is an alien.
Oh yeah, because he has a mask at the end of.
It never shows him as an alien, but he is working with aliens, and then he escapes in a puff of smoke and leaves behind only a rubber mask of his face, thus implying that he was an alien. But he actually reappeared a couple years ago and was like, "Hey, I wasn't an alien. I just got kidnapped by aliens, but I'm back now, and I'm not." And
they just happened to leave a rubber mask of my face.
You can't see it, but I'm shrugging, folks. So yeah, that's issue 2. He begins working for the Bugle and beats up old men.
We're not going to have time to go through all of these issues.
That's why I'm being very quick with them. Issue 3 introduces Dr. Octopus, which is like one of Spider-Man's big arch nemeses. For more on that story, watch Spider-Man 2, starring Alfred Molina. Dr. Octopus is the first character that can break Spider-Man's webbing, which causes and he actually beats Spider-Man in their first encounter, which causes a big crisis of faith in Spider-Man.
This was huge. Like, reading this, I was like, wow, Spider-Man goes in and doesn't immediately win.
Yeah. One of the big tenets of telling a Spider-Man story is failure. And we'll get into that later on the topic of what's referred to in universe as Parker luck. Anyways, Peter Parker goes to a school assembly where Johnny Storm shows off and says, "Believe in yourself." And Peter says, "Yeah." And then he goes and beats up Dr. Octopus. And that's that. This issue also features another tenet of Spider-Man stories, that being Peter using more than just brute strength to defeat his opponents. In that he creates a chemical concoction that like fuses two of Dr. Octopus's arms together. And then he beats up Dr. Octopus and wins the day. Issue 4 introduces the Sandman.
Woo!
Yes. He is honestly one of my favorite Spider-Man villains because eventually he becomes sort of like an anti-hero. He kind of flips back and forth between villain and anti-hero depending on how he's feeling. There was a recent story that was in, I believe it was Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, which is usually like a secondary ongoing to sort of kind of support the main Amazing Spider-Man ongoing. There was a very good story featuring Sandman coming to grips with his own mortality in that series. So this is a very good example of a thing that happens a lot in older comics, which is very awkwardly and heavily explaining a character's powers, because Spider-Man tries to fight Sandman and says, word for word, "He's slipping through my fingers, just like soft sand." And then he tries to punch him, but his fist goes through him, and Sandman says, "Now do you see why they call me the Sandman?" And Peter Parker says, "It's unbelievable, your body is sand," etc., etc. And then I believe Sandman breaks into Peter's school or something. Something like that. This issue also introduces Betty Brant, who is J. Jonah Jameson's secretary, and the first love interest of Peter, which is problematic because Peter is in high school and Betty's like in her mid-20s.
Oh.
Like, it is very, like, he says a lot in future issues, like, "Betty, the first woman I loved." And it's like, all right, dude, you're like 15.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to tell in this art style because age is kind of, in Steve Ditko's art style, characters are either young or old.
There is no in between. You are young, you are old.
But in later retellings of this kind of era, it is very clear, like, oh, Betty Brant's like a working adult, and Peter is a child, and he's trying to like make moves on her. So then Sandman breaks into Peter's high school and tries to hold kids hostage, and then Spider-Man traps him in a shop vac, and that's how he defeats Sandman.
I love that sometimes Spider-Man doesn't go and find trouble. He's like, "I'm gonna go take a picture of this person."
Yeah.
And just happens to fight them because he's there.
Yeah.
Not, "I'm gonna stop crime today."
Yeah, it's like, because like the first Amazing Fantasy 15 was very much like, oh, great power comes great responsibility. Like, it's his responsibility to fight crime. But then like every subsequent issue is just like, oh crap, a criminal. I can make money off of this if I take pictures of me fighting him.
It's like, I'm going to go get a picture. But also, I'm probably going to stop this dude on the way there.
Right. What also should be mentioned, they've already been introduced at this point, but Flash Thompson, Peter's bully, and Liz Allen, his high school crush, are also characters that exist. Issue 4 has Peter almost beating the crap out of Flash, but then realizing, oh wait, I have superpowers, I would just cave his skull in.
I'd absolutely murder this kid. We'll let him live.
So then all of his classmates thinks he's a coward, including Liz, but he's like, well, that's my curse of being Spider-Man. Issue 5 has him fight Dr. Doom, which is strange, because usually Spider-Man and Dr. Doom don't operate in the same circles, but there you go. Dr. Doom is the other villain that uses a machine that talks to spiders so that he can contact Spider-Man because reasons.
Because I'm sure that exists somewhere.
Right. This issue also starts to introduce the concept of Flash Thompson being Spider-Man's biggest fan, so much so that he dresses up like Spider-Man, and then Dr. Doom kidnaps him because he thinks that Flash is Spider-Man.
Because Dr. Doom is an idiot.
So then Peter's like, well, I kind of hate this kid because he bullies me all the time, but also I'm Spider-Man and Dr. Doom might kill him, so I guess I have to rescue him. So he does. I've kind of, I always forget this issue exists, because it's not, the first 10 issues, most of them introduce like a new Spider-Man villain that becomes iconic, so I just kind of forget about the issue where he fights Dr. Doom.
Is Dr. Doom not new?
He's famous for fighting the Fantastic Four.
Oh.
Did you not know that?
I did not know that.
Okay, well then, I guess I should explain. Dr. Doom is Fantastic Four's like big like arch enemy. He's also usually like one of the big bads of the Marvel Universe in general. So yeah, I think his motivations for this issue, for issue 5, was that he wanted to like recruit Spider-Man to help him fight the Fantastic Four or something.
Something like that. Something along those lines.
Yeah. And then issue 6 introduces the Lizard, another big iconic Spider-Man villain. The Lizard is one that kind of fluctuates a lot because he goes between like just being like a normal dude with lizard-like skin that hates humans to being like a feral lizard person. In his first appearance, he is just like kind of an evil mastermind that has lizard skin. The Lizard is one of many early Marvel villains that are very Jekyll and Hyde, in that they have like a good side and a bad side, and there's like some form of transformation. Because the Lizard's secret identity is Dr. Kurt Connors, who lost his arm in the war. As mentioned previously, Marvel has a sliding timescale, so which war that is changes as time goes on. And he creates a lizard serum because lizards can regrow limbs, but it turns him into a lizard person.
I'm not going to regrow a human limb. I'm going to regrow a lizard limb.
Yeah, that's comics. And he has the ability to control other lizards because reasons. But Spider-Man, using his chemistry brain, manages to turn him back.
Does he get to keep the arm?
Nope, the arm also leaves. I should also mention that this issue takes place in Florida. And a B plot is that J. Jonah Jameson sent him to Florida to take pictures of the lizard. But then he does, and J. Jonah Jameson is like, the lizard isn't real, so these pictures are garbage. And it's kind of like, but you sent him down
me for this reason.
You sent me to prove that the lizard is real, and now that I have proof he's okay. So yet again, Peter is poor. J. Jonah Jameson hates Spider-Man. All of his friends at school think he's a loser because he stood them all up to go to Florida, etc., etc. Issue 7 is the first issue to have a recurring villain, that being the Vulture. This is also an interesting case wherein the Vulture, like the villain, learns from his mistakes. Because in the Vulture's first appearance, in issue 2, Spider-Man used like a little magnetic inverter, which is totally a real thing and not just pseudoscience. He uses a magnetic inverter to depower the Vulture's wings. I don't know. I almost said the wizard. That's a different.
Just.
So then the Vulture shows up again, and he's like, haha, now your magnetic inverter does not work on me, fool. So then Spider-Man just kind of beats the crap out of him.
He said, we're going to do this the old-fashioned way. And
this is another case where Spider-Man loses their first encounter and actually, like, injures his arm. Spider-Man is kind of unique in early superheroes that, like, he can get hurt, and it does have lasting ramifications. Because now Peter Parker has to, like, come up with an excuse for having a broken arm, and Spider-Man has to, like, hide that he has a broken arm. So then Peter goes to the Daily Bugle offices to try and sell his photos, and the Vulture breaks in to steal, I think, payrolls. And then they fight, and then Vulture pulls him high into the sky, and then Spider-Man beats him up and floats down in a whipping parachute. And this bothers me, because they are inconsistent with what Spider-Man can make out of his webbing. Because in this issue, he flies thousands of feet into the air. Maybe not thousands, I'm not good with distance. He flies very high into the air with the Vulture, and then ties the Vulture up, and then makes a webbing parachute. But in many future issues, he is in instances where he is falling from a very far height.
And just can't do anything
about it. And just can't do anything.
Whoops.
And it's like, did you just forget, Peter? Did that just conveniently slip your mind? I don't get it. And then he makes some moves on Betty Brant, and it's weird. And then that's the end of the issue. Issue 8 features a robot called the Living Brain and a boxing match between Peter Parker and Flash Thompson.
What happened to I'm not going to fight Flash Thompson because
Well, here's the thing, Kendra. You see, Flash breaks his glasses. Flash breaks Peter's glasses. And now that's the last straw.
All bets are off.
All bets are off.
If I have to cave this kid's head in, then so be it.
But the Living Brain is a robot that's brought in to show how powerful computers are. And Peter's like, crap, this thing could probably calculate that I'm Spider-Man. Because that's how computers work.
Obviously. Especially in the 60s.
Yeah. And then there's two crooks that are there that want to steal the brain for themselves for money reasons. And then Peter and Flash fight, and Peter tries to give Flash the equivalent of like a very, very light love tap, but it sends him flying across the room because Peter is a superhero and Flash is a regular human being. And then the crooks try to steal the brain, and it ends up like reprogramming it and making it go evil, which is, again, totally a thing that happens to computers.
The 60s were a wild time for computers.
Yeah. Isn't it crazy how the computers in the 60s were way more advanced than computers we have now? Isn't that insane? Isn't that wild? How did we lose all that technology?
We've been retconned.
Oh my god. So then the fight continues, and Peter tries to give him another love tap, but Flash gets distracted by someone screaming about the robot, so everyone thinks that Peter's a loser for hitting Flash while he's distracted. So once again, Peter is reviled in the eyes of his peers. Pretty standard for Peter Parker.
I appreciate that Flash got up and was like, I'm going to continue fighting, even though you knocked me across the room with one punch.
He always says, I guess I tripped, and then just gets back in the ring.
No one says anything about it. We're just going to keep fighting.
Oh, man.
Like, Peter did not just uppercut my man across the room.
Crazy. I don't know, man. Boys are going to be boys. So then Flash accidentally trips the two crooks and is given credit for stopping them. And Spider-Man manages to power down the robot. And then we're back at status quo of Peter Parker being hated and Flash being loved. And then there's a B story about Spider-Man fighting the Human Torch because reasons. I think they just wanted another excuse to put the Fantastic Four in an issue of Spider-Man. There's something about Peter being jealous of the Spider-Man of the Human Torch getting women. And then the rest of the Fantastic Four show up and be like, hey, stop being a literal child. And then Spider-Man tries to fight them as well.
Anyone in a costume, Spider-Man will fight.
But then the Invisible Woman manages to calm him down with her feminine wiles. And then Peter stops fighting because a woman told him to. Because this is the 60s.
Female told me stop fighting. I shall stop fighting.
Oh, Lord. Okay, 2 more issues. Issue 9 introduces Electro, who his costume looks kind of stupid, but he's personally one of my favorite Spider-Man villains.
This is an idiotic costume.
It looks like he's wearing a flower on his face. But this is usually my go-to example of weird early comics pseudoscience, because Max Dillon was I don't know what the term is. He worked on like electric poles, like power poles. And then while he was working one, he got struck by lightning, and somehow that gave him the ability to contain and shoot electricity out of his body.
Literally nothing in this is real science. There is no real science found in Spider-Man whatsoever. Do not try any of this at home.
Of course not. So then Aunt May falls ill, and Peter's poor, so he can't afford to.
I don't know what happened to his well-paying job as a freelance photographer.
I could not imagine how being a freelance photographer in the 1960s could not be a reliable source of income. But then this whole time Electro's committing crimes, and he's seen using electricity as like a magnet to climb up the side of a building. So then J. Jonah Jameson sees that and thinks, wait a minute, Spider-Man can climb walls. Electro must be Spider-Man, even though Spider-Man has never shown the ability to shoot electricity from his fingers. But Electro must be Spider-Man. So then Spider-Man takes it on himself to fight Electro, because I guess all of the robberies and assaults were not motivation enough to fight Electro.
No, being Spider-Man is the last straw. How dare you be me?
How dare you ruin my reputation?
Peter Parker has no responsibility to fight crime. He fights crime purely because...
Mostly out of spite. Either out of spite or for money.
Yeah.
Which is like, again, in Amazing Fantasy 15, they spent a lot of time being like, great power, great responsibility, etc., etc.
And throws it completely out the window.
Out the window. So then Spider-Man loses the first fight, as is the formula now. But then he puts on rubber boots and gloves and punches Electro a bunch until he falls down. I think he sprays him. Yes, he sprays him with water, which shorts him out, because that's how electricity works. And then he shows J. Jonah Jameson the pictures of Spider-Man fighting Electro, therefore proving that they are not one and the same. And then he goes on a date with Betty Brant, who is an adult.
Should not be dating this absolute child.
And then issue 10 introduces a gang known as the Enforcers, who are my favorite defunct Spider-Man villains. Out of the villains that appear in early issues that do not appear anywhere else, they are my favorite. The Enforcers are a group of 4 people. It is the leader, the big man, who wears like a mask and has a voice changer.
Not the biggest one in the group.
Ox, who is a large and wide fellow. Montana, who wears a cowboy hat and uses a lasso. And Fancy Dan, my favorite of the 4. Fancy Dan is a short man who knows judo, and he wears bright purple suits, and that is his character. And
that's all character development he gets.
He is my favorite. I love Fancy Dan. He rarely ever appears, but he is my favorite character. Because he is just such a simple concept, but just used to its fullest extent. He is a small man who wears purple suits and knows judo. That's
he is 3 things, and he does these 3 things well.
He does these 3 things very well. So the Enforcers start taking over gangs and committing very well-planned robberies. In the meantime, Aunt May is still ill, so Peter gives her a blood transfusion, and he's like, whoa, my blood is radioactive. But nothing comes of that, so it doesn't matter.
I feel like this is something he should have thought of before going through a blood transfusion.
Probably. And then this issue also introduces Freddie Foswell, who is a reporter that works for J. Jonah Jameson. And then the Enforcers are trying to muscle Betty Brant for money, and Peter shows up for her defense, and they muscle him instead, even though he's Spider-Man. And then there's a weird scene where Peter is trying to track down the Enforcers, so he kidnaps like a random dude off the street and like puts them in a warehouse that's like covered in webs, and he has like this big fake spider that he made out of webbing, and he's like, if you do not answer my questions, I will feed you to my spider. It's like, what the heck, dude? That's like malicious. So then he eventually tracks down the Enforcers and fights them and loses, as is the formula.
as it goes.
And then as he escapes, he sees J. Jonah Jameson nearby and thinks maybe J. Jonah Jameson is the big man.
They love just accusing each other of being people.
Yeah, there's a formula. So then Peter Parker starts spreading the word that like he knows things about the Enforcers and the big man, which as is his plan, leads to him getting kidnapped. So he's put like right in their headquarters, and then he beats up a bunch of people and calls the cops on them. And it's eventually revealed that the big man was actually Freddy Fazbear, which could have been a good lead up if Freddy Fazbear had been introduced prior to this issue.
The one new character is the
new villain. What a concept!
Wow, shocker.
Then the issue ends with Peter angstily panging over Betty Brant because the Enforcers clearly had some dirt on her, but woe is Peter, the 20-year-old woman won't confide in the high schooler. And that's it. So very, all of these stories clearly had a formula. It was very clearly all just like by the numbers of like.
It is very clear that Peter Parker wasn't placed on this earth to make the world a better place. Peter Parker's out only for himself.
Yeah. Well, technically, also for his aunt, but mostly for himself. Do you have anything to add?
No, just that Peter Parker kind of sucks.
Yeah, he's not great. He goes through a lot of obviously, like, these stories happened, 80 years ago?
That's so many years.
That's a lot of years. So obviously there's been 80 years of character development, and nowadays, like, Peter Parker is one of the sweetest people in comic books.
Not then. Not back then.
Not back then. He had a lot of learning to do.
I appreciate that they gave you all of the villains that you could ever need back to back.
Mm-hmm. I mean, for their credit, they kept like coming up with new ones. They only reused a villain once.
They did. They were like, all right, there's a villain. Villain is defeated. They never come back.
Yeah. Peter Parker is somewhat unique amongst superheroes in that he actually ages over time. It's not in real time. God, it's not in real time. But he does eventually graduate high school and goes to college, and he does eventually graduate college. But it takes a very long time. But yeah, the goal of, in terms of like Marvel versus DC, Marvel's difference is that their characters are more human and relatable, and Spider-Man is like the epitome of that. Spider-Man is a character that fails. Spider-Man is a character that things don't always like actually work out for him in the end. He has to make sacrifices. He has to make choices that impact both him as Peter Parker and him as Spider-Man, which makes him a very human and very relatable character. And I think that's a good ending point for that. So in 2 weeks, we will be talking about volumes 1 and 2 of the New 52 reboot of Batman. So that is issues, I believe, 1 through 12 of the 2011 Batman ongoing title, which is collected in, I believe the name of the trade paperbacks that collects them are The Court of Owls, and I think, sorry, I'm pulling it up right now. I should have prepared this. Yes. So we're talking about Volume 1 and Volume 2 of 2011's Batman ongoing, which are titled The Court of Owls and The City of Owls. And they collect issues 1 through 12 and the first annual. And to prep for that, next week we will be talking about the DC timeline and what the New 52 is, as well as all of the Robins. Because
I love talking about the Robins.
So do I. I love the Robins. We're specifically talking about that because the 2011 series is part of the New 52 rebrand, which was supposed to be a new entry point for new comic book readers. So to do that, they scaled back the timeline significantly so that all of the heroes have only been doing their hero thing for 5 years. But they also they cherry picked which bits of history still existed, which included all of the Robins.
All of the Robins fit into 5 years.
So Batman adopted, trained, and at some point graduated 4 different Robins within 5 years.
Just really churning them out. He only wants boys the age of 13 or 14, and then he's done.
So yes, next week we will be talking about in depth the DC timeline and by extension the different eras of comic books. I mentioned during today's episode the Silver Age. So we will be explaining what that is next week, as well as going into detail of each of the Robins, and I might extend into like other members of the Bat family that appear in the Court of Owls and the City of Owls. If you want to contact us, if you have questions or suggestions for or future topics that you would like us to cover, you can tweet at us at CBBCPod. That's at CBBCPOD, or email us at cbbcpod@gmail.com. Until next time,
we're your hosts, Kendra Forte
and Matt Lasik. Excelsior!